We have an amazing speaker for you today, Professor Clare Mackay, who is a wonderful woman who I've known since 2006, I think we tried to establish. She's done amazing science over the years, but she has done that in spite of the odds, if you like, both being a woman and various other things she will tell us today. But I think one of the things that has always struck me with Clare is how much of a resilience she has, how much of a way of dealing with the things that are given to her. And really when she started telling us about what she has been going through in the sort of outside of what we knew, I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to get her to tell her the story of what it's really like, how we can overcome these obstacles and still be fully flourishing people. And when she also then told me about all the kind of artwork and the things that she's been really excited by, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that the center wants to have. And so please, Clare, tell us about your journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morten. Thank you all for coming along today to hear about this topic that you've probably not heard very much about before. Again, thank you for the invitation. And really, it was when Morten gave a talk in the Department of Psychiatry a few months ago that Morten and I have been working sort of around each other for many, many years. But actually, it was for the first time, because of the story that I'm going to tell you, that I kind of got it, what Morten does. And the whole kind of trying to pull many threads together to really understand what human flourishing means now makes sense to me in a way that it never used to. So again, thank you, Morten, for having me today. I'm going to be telling you about something called body-focused repetitive behaviours. These are behaviours that many people have that are focused on themselves. They have terrible names. The whole thing is covered in terrible names. So BFRBs is already too much of a mouthful, body-focused repetitive behaviours. But then the names of the actual disorders are even worse. So trichotillomania is the horrendous Greek name for hair-pulling disorder. Dermatillomania, or even worse, excoriation disorder, is what people with skin picking get labelled as, according to the official diagnostic manuals. And then there's even horrendous Greek words, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce, for nail biting. But these disorders go beyond those. Those are the kind of the big three, if you like, but it goes beyond that to things that, again, are really common: lip picking, cheek biting, lots of things that people find themselves doing. They don't really want to do them, but somehow they keep finding themselves doing them anyway. Now, I would love it if after today you knew 6 things about BFRBs. And the first thing is that they exist. So we're already in a good place. And then I'm going to tell you the other 5 things I want you to know, and then you can all nod off if you want to, because after that it's going to be stories about me and I'll tell you lots more things, but these are the things I really want you to know. So I'm putting them right at the top while everybody's still alert. So the first thing is that people who suffer from these disorders suffer uncontrollable urges. Nobody is making a conscious decision that they want to pull out their hair, pick at their skin, etc. Now, of course, this is my hand, so it is me that's doing it, but there is no frontal lobe conscious decision being made that I want to do it. So people with these disorders, the biggest problem that we face is that the world at large, and even we ourselves, assume that we should be in control of this behaviour, and we're not. So uncontrollable is number 2. Number 3 is that they are surprisingly common. So they're probably the most common disorder you've never heard of. The estimates, and I have to say that the epidemiological evidence isn't strong, so it's to some extent the jury's still out, but the estimates are that somewhere around 2% of people have hair pulling disorder, around the same percentage have skin picking disorder, and of course nail biting is really common, particularly in children. Probably 50% of children bite their nails, and so these behaviours are really common. And when these behaviours get to the level of being a disorder, and what that really means is that people have significant distress around the disorder, they do indeed cause a huge amount of distress to people's lives. And so I'm now connected with many online communities of people with these disorders, and the stories of lives lived that were less than they could have been are common in this community. People who really struggle with a lot of day-to-day activities because of having these disorders. The fifth thing I want you to know is that these behaviours are not a symptom of something else. So it's really common that even when people have heard anything about these disorders, that they make assumptions about maybe it's just a symptom of anxiety, or it's a type of OCD, or maybe it's like a mild form of self-harm. There's lots of sort of assumptions that people make about these behaviours being a symptom of something that they know more about. And what you can see on the graph here is that comorbidities are really common. So if you take a population of people with trichotillomania, for example, you'll see a high rate of comorbidities. 50 to 60% of people with these disorders do have difficulties with anxiety. Around 40% will have problems with mood. And then if you look at pretty much across the whole range of psychiatric disorders, you'll see a sort of 20 to 25% comorbidity. So comorbidities are really common. But importantly, there's also a chunk of people down here, the 20% or so at the bottom, who have no other identifiable psychiatric disorder. I put myself in that category. And so these what I take from this is that this is a motor symptom of distress. The distress can come from anywhere, but the disorder itself is distinct from all of these other things. And that's number 5. And then number 6 is that shame and stigma are really pervasive around these disorders, both shame for the person who suffers from it and stigma in the world at large. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that as I go through the talk today. So if you could take nothing away apart from this one slide, I would be totally delighted. So let me tell you a bit about, do you want to ask a question? No, I don't mind. Yes, they do co-occur. Oh, they often co-occur. Yeah, good question. So let me tell you a bit about my own story. So these are pictures of me. I'm probably about 6 or 7 in the photo on the left, and I'm about 11 years old in the photo on the right. And the photo on the right, I think, is the last photo of me where you can still clearly see my eyelashes. So my first and biggest problem throughout my life has been having uncontrollable urges to pull out my own eyelashes. At some point that spread to the crown of my head. So I don't really do that anymore, but I used to pull out hair from a sort of patch on the crown of my head. And then eventually I moved on to my eyebrows. And essentially for the whole of my life, since age 11, 12-ish, I've had uncontrollable urges to pull out the hair from my head and face. Some people with these disorders also have the urge to eat the hair. Unfortunately, that isn't the case for me, but many people do. People often have kind of rituals around feeling the hair, looking at the hair, etc. I can't really identify the exact time when my urges started, but this wasn't a great time of my life. So this period of my life coincided with the breakup of the marriage of my parents. So I was sort of dealing with some stuff around there. It wasn't an acrimonious divorce. It wasn't anything terrible, but, you know, I was an 11-year-old child dealing with some stuff there. But then probably more importantly, it was the transition from primary school to secondary school. And that didn't go well for me. So I was quite badly bullied when I moved into secondary school. And that's really the sort of trauma in my mind that coincides quite strongly with the beginning of having the urges to pull out my own hair. So as I say, this started when I was about 11 or 12, and less than a year ago, so aged 50, I started to think that I could talk about this out loud. So that means there were 40 years pretty much of living with the secret shame of having a disorder, one of these disorders. And one of the sort of I suppose ironies of having a disorder like this is that it's a very hidden disorder, as in most people don't know about it. And those people who have it are masters of disguise. So I would, for the whole of my life, have done anything to avoid you knowing that I pull out my hair. It's a hidden disorder in that those who have it want to hide more than anything else. And yet, actually, it's in plain sight if you know where to look. So I've the age that I am, the generation that I am means, and the shame that I felt means that I don't really have any good photographs to show you of all those years in between, because the last thing I ever would have wanted was photographic evidence of what I did to myself. So the photo on the left here is at my sister's wedding, and if you look closely, you can see that there are no eyelashes and no eyebrows underneath the makeup that I'm wearing. And then the photos on the right were both taken last year. Before and after, I had microblading as a semi-permanent makeup for my eyebrows. But it's the first time I even felt able to take a photo of myself without makeup on. So you can see a little bit of a kind of before and after. So the world is used to seeing me looking like this one, the bottom right photo. But what I see when I look in the mirror is the top right one. And of course, every single day, I feel the need to hide and cover what's in that top photo so that you can't see it. One of the most difficult things about living with a disorder like this is feeling really alone with it. And I think that that's really common in the community of people that I now know with these disorders. And what I've put on this slide is a few populations of people who make you feel alone. So on the top row there, you have doctors. There's a group of doctors there. I've talked to lots of doctors, both GPs, psychiatrists, psychologists, etc., most of whom tell me they've never heard of it. These are all direct quotes, by the way, things that I've heard from these populations. I've heard that it's not a proper condition. It doesn't really count, it doesn't really count. I've never seen a patient, so it doesn't really count. The middle population there is hairdressers. I've started talking to hairdressers because, they probably have a really important role to play. They've also never heard of it. And they say it's not a hair problem. It's, some weird psychiatric, psychological thing, not their problem. And then the group at the bottom are cartoon scientists who also have never heard of it, are much more likely to say, isn't it just a symptom of, or isn't it just a type of, and you'll never get funding. It's not interesting. Nobody's going to fund it. So that all makes you feel a bit alone. And the loudest message that people with these disorders get by far is this one. Why don't you just stop? Just stop. Oh, as if we hadn't thought of that. And sadly, that's also, that message is also loud and clear from our own friends and family who, in the absence of any other knowledge or information, all they want you to do is stop, because you're damaging yourself, you're making yourself feel bad, you're making yourself look worse than you otherwise would. They haven't got any other tools, so they say, why don't you just stop? So as the person suffering from this disorder, all you have to feel is, why can't I just stop? Why can't I just stop? So when I had some therapy over the last few years, and my therapist encouraged me. The therapy actually wasn't for trichotillomania. Trichotillomania was just there as an example of the sense that I wasn't feeling quite right in myself. But she asked me to paint a picture in my mind of what it feels like when you're in an episode, of pulling out your hair. And I described, those mechanical claws that you see in scrapyards that pick stuff up. I described being inside one of those. So the feeling of being in an episode is of being completely powerless against something that's much, much stronger than you are. The sense of being, I feel utterly weak and feeble when I'm in an episode. I don't have anything. I have no strength that I can use to overcome the urge. And then she asked me to describe what the opposite of the urge feels like. And that's the wide open world, sunshine, view, being in nature, all of the things that we know are the ways in which we as human beings flourish. And so I described that, and then I went away and had a go at painting it. And so this is a painting from a while ago now, but this is my first attempt to try and capture the two ways you feel. But the point is that the me that's sitting out there and looking at the sunset knows that mechanical claw is lurking in the background and can come and get me whenever it feels like it, because I'm not in control of it. And then when you're inside the mechanical claw, it's really about powerlessness. So there's nothing you can do. You are weak and feeble in comparison to the claw. You're also, the reason for the claw is because you're also kind of scrunched up. It feels like it's a physical constriction feeling, as well as being a sort of a powerlessness feeling. So there's a kind of a closedness and an openness, which are the two opposite sides of this feeling. Another aspect of the way that it feels when you're in an episode. So I didn't quite say that when I have an episode of pulling it, they do come in episodes. So most of the time I don't have any urges to pull out my hair. The episodes come when they feel like coming. Seems to be out of the blue for me a lot of the time. But when they come, they've got me until they let me go. And so one of the phenomena that needs to be explained by anybody who's trying to understand these disorders is this sense of the trance that you go into, and that's how it feels. So I tried to paint that as well. And so this is a sense of being drawn into something, and you're being drawn towards the warmth and the light in the middle of this these circles, but you're kind of stuck out here in the cold and the dark. And in the real life version of this picture, it's got some three-dimensional bits that you could pick off if you could get your hands on it. So there's a sense of trying to get to something that's smooth and warm and nice and lovely, but you never get there because you're always out here picking away at something, and that never comes. That sense of achievement never comes, because of course, as soon as you break out of the trance, you realize the damage you've done, and then you're stuck with the consequences of that. So one of the things about living with a disorder like this is that you have to, in effect, hold the contradictions that society gives to you. And this is the most obvious way of describing that. So I struggle all the time between these two statements. It's not a big deal. No one can tell. It's only hair. No one's really that interested. As I've already said, most doctors and psychologists have never heard of it. There's virtually no research, there's very little research that's been done, and no one will fund it. So it's just not a big deal. It doesn't count, doesn't matter. On the other hand, we're also very strongly told that it is a big deal. What will people think if they knew what we did to ourselves? We can't let anybody see, we can't let anybody know. And I think there's something important about our hair and our skin and our nails. I think as Homo sapiens, they're kind of our peacock feathers. We might like to pretend we don't care what people think of how we look, but actually we really care what people think about how we look. I've spent my whole life pretending that I don't care how people, about what people think how I look. But actually that's to deny reality. It's not true. We do really care. The other reason it is a big deal is because we feel distress, and that's the last point really. But also we get distress given to us by the people who love us, and so back to the parents who have no other tools other than to tell us to stop it, and they tell us to stop it because we're not making, it's a bad thing to do. We shouldn't do it to ourselves. So we take on that distress ourselves. That's quite difficult to live with. And then the biggest reason why actually it really should be a big deal, and it does deserve our attention, is because the personal distress that's experienced by people with these disorders is real, it's deep, and it's chronic. So living with this contradiction is a funny thing. This is a sketch of a painting that you'll see again later, but I'm using it here to demonstrate the feelings that you live with when you're living with this contradiction. So through the therapy that I had, a really important part of that was to learn the strength and depth of the shame that you feel as a consequence of having these disorders. And shame had three things to say to me. My shame had three things to say to me. It said, I'm weak, I'm stupid, and I'm ugly because I can't control my urges to pull out my hair. I'm weak because these are my hands. I mean, come on. These are my hands and I can't control them. I'm stupid. I must be stupid. I must be stupid if I can't control these urges. And I'm ugly because of the consequences of what the disorder does to me. And until you say those words out loud, until you say your shame out loud, it's got you. It effectively runs the show. But it's also true, and thank you, Morten, in your introduction for saying nice things about this, that I'm a successful academic. I've taken part in triathlons and half marathons, and I'm happily married and I have a beautiful son. I've actually got all the things that many people want in their lives, and so that's true too. And I think that one of the things that's really difficult, I suppose, to comprehend yourself, but then also to communicate, is that you can be both. You can be both the successful, you know, XYZ, and live with some difficult stuff in the background as well. And I think the way you live with it is by getting really good at reading the script. So this picture's work in progress and it's called the script. So my script says, I'm happy, I'm calm, and I'm confident. And as I stand before you now, I'm sure you can all see my script with your own eyes. I'm very good at reading my script and being able to perform the role that I give to myself. But it's also true that in the background, the voices are telling me that I'm weak, I'm stupid, and I'm ugly, and fundamentally that for all those reasons, I'm not good enough. And I think lots of people live with the script and the reality. I don't think there's anything particularly unique about that, but I think that it's useful. I found it incredibly useful to be honest with myself about it and to recognize that the both are me. So living with the script and living with the difference between what the outside world sees and what you see from the inside, I think you can, probably lots of people live their whole lives like that. I found that I lived most of my life so far like that, but there came a point where I couldn't carry on like that anymore. And I kind of hit a bit of a wall a couple of years ago, and it was, you know, it'd been a really, really busy time at work. COVID had happened, menopause had happened for me. And I just kind of thought, I'm not enjoying this anymore. I need to take some time out. I need a break. I need to work on myself. I need to do something different. So I took the summer off, and I'd already told you I'd been having some therapy, and that had kind of come to an end, and I was feeling good about that. But I thought, I just need to kind of press the reset button, because I'm not quite sure what I want to do with the next decade of my career. I'm not sure that I want to carry on doing what I'm doing. I think there's something else for me, but I don't know what it is yet. So I spent the summer, I took the summer off. I took a few months of unpaid leave and didn't do anything very exciting. I hung out with my then 8 or 9-year-old. And I did a lot of reading and thinking, and found some good people to follow on YouTube, and I read a lot of books, and I wanted to sort of pay tribute to these three. There are lots more good books on my bookshelf, but these three, when I think about it, each had a really key message for me that informs what happens next. So The Compassionate Mind by Paul Gilbert is really the Bible of understanding compassion. And I'm going to reduce what is an incredible work of brilliance into just a single sentence because of what it means to me. And what the Compassionate Mind gave me is the sense that everything we think and feel and do exists for a reason that we can find in our evolutionary story. So we all have to live in the modern world, but we have 300 years of evolving as Homo sapiens to be hunter-gatherers. And there's so much there's so much relief that we can get from understanding ourselves through that evolutionary lens. And that's what I got from that book. The second book is Healing the Shame That Binds You, which John Bradshaw was actually, I'm not exactly sure what his profession was, but he was somebody I think he'd been an alcoholic, and he'd kind of gone through the whole healing process, and he'd understood the breadth and depth of his own shame, but also then became a bit of an expert on shame and a brilliant writer and talker about shame. This book was written in 1984, and it's got some real gold in it. So I recommend it if you're interested in shame. And the things that I got from this are these two little snippets, which I take with me, which is the only way out of your shame is through it. You have to go through it in order to be free of it. And then the other is behind your greatest shame is your greatest power. So I hope that will apply to me. And then the third one is The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. I don't know whether people have come across this book. It describes itself as a 12-week recovery program for your creativity. And so its sort of central tenet is that we are born creative. We are all creative, but in our souls, but that life gets in the way of your creativity, and you get in your own way in all sorts of ways of being able to express yourself creatively. And it advocates some really quite simple practices, including morning pages, which is essentially just journaling as a way of write down whatever the stuff is that's in your head, get it out of the way, and then you can create. And I did the discipline of it for a little while and really liked it. And unlike how I'd always thought of journaling, the way that Julia Cameron talks about morning pages is that you write them and you throw them away. You're never going back to them. You're never going to look at it again. You're literally just writing the stuff out of your head, and then you can get on with your, then you can create. So those are 3 books and the single messages I got from them that meant a lot to me. So then I came back to work and hadn't yet sort of found what it was that I wanted to do next, but I sort of started to identify some of the strands, and I decided that it would be a good idea to engage a coach. So I don't know if any of you have used a coach for work before. They're particularly brilliant if you're kind of going through some sort of transition or transformation or whatever it is, just somebody to bounce back and forth ideas with. And so I'd had a coach that I'd worked with before, and we met in a space in the middle of Oxford underneath this very lampshade. And this very lampshade became important in the conversation, because as we talked, the idea that I could put together 30 years of neuroscience and 40 years of lived experience with a body-focused repetitive disorder started to emerge. And when I say it now, it feels like it should have been obvious, but it took a while. It took a while to recognize that without changing my job really very much at all, I could maybe do something useful in relation to these disorders. I could use the platform that I have. I'm a professor of neuroscience in the University of Oxford. If I say some stuff about this, people might listen to me, And so, as I say, it sort of slowly emerged sitting under this very lampshade. And she said, oh, look, it's like the ideas all start to converge together. And so that's why that lampshade will always be an important part of the story. So, and that under that lampshade, the idea of becoming the trick prof was born. And so this was really just a year ago that this all started to happen. So that brings me back to telling you what I've learned in that last year about body-focused repetitive behaviours in general, but in trichotillomania in particular, because that's my one. So this is the first thing I did actually was make a bit of an infographic. I wanted to try to put the really key things together into a bit of an infographic. And on this infographic are the things I've already told you. They were part of they were my 6 things. So it exists, it's uncontrollable, it's common, it causes a lot of distress, it's not a symptom of something else. And then here's some other bits and pieces that you might be interested in relation to it. So it mostly starts in adolescence. So my age of onset is pretty much exactly the average age of onset. It's as I've already said, really, that most people with these disorders never seek treatment, and those that do, unfortunately, largely find that the people that they ask for help don't have any help to offer them, don't have any knowledge about what help might be useful for them. In psychiatry, we talk about functional impairment, which is the impairment to your sort of everyday activities. And so people with these disorders have a moderate level of functional impairment. And that means things like not wanting to go out, not wanting to, restricting certain leisure activities, like not going swimming, not wanting to do sports that's going to reveal your particular manifestation of your disorder. So there's a moderate level of functional impairment and a high level of distress. There's a kind of a myth, really, that it's much more common in women than men. But that myth has some basis in the evidence, which is that if you look at populations of people who seek treatment or volunteer to be participants in studies and trials, then you do indeed see a much higher predominance of women. It's about 4 to 1. About 80% of those populations tend to be women. But the only population sampling that's been done, community samples that have been done both in adults and in children, suggest that the behaviour is actually 50-50. So I think that means that the distress is more likely to be higher in women, but the actual behaviour is probably equal in males and females. And then the last thing to know is that the triggers for the episodes aren't all the same. I've put 3 different types of triggers here that I experience, and I think other people have other ones as well. And so the things that are likely to trigger an episode for me include, so it is true, and the thing that I think most people think of is that there's some sort of emotional or psychological component to the triggering of these things. And it's definitely true that if I'm particularly stressed about something or particularly ruminating over something, then I am more likely to pull at myself. There's a lot of automatic behavior, so that there's a sort of there's a distinction made between focused pulling, where you're actually targeting a particular hair, and automatic pulling, which is something you find yourself doing. So for me, a really big trigger is reading a thesis. When I'm examining a thesis and I've got a whole bloody thesis to read, there's nothing to do except read, and I have to tape up my fingers on days like that, otherwise I will pull out a lot of hair. But there's no emotional distress going on there. Yeah.
Does talking about it somehow trigger it as well, or not at all? Because I would assume, because the moment you start talking about it, I start picking up my fingers. the idea of it is
right. So that's interesting, and I wonder whether listening to it is different than talking about it. So talking about it, definitely the opposite. So I'm much less likely to have the urges when I'm talking about it, but I wonder whether listening to it is different than talking to it. Yes, people do wear wigs. So some people pull out all their hair, and there's lots of talk about where to find good ways of hiding the baldness. Oh yeah, it doesn't. You wouldn't pull at your wig. It just wouldn't do it. Just wouldn't do it. You take the wig off and pull your hair. Yeah, it just wouldn't give you any satisfaction to pull at the wig. There are all sorts of things you can do to try and direct your picky fingers, though. I mean, if you watch me, I'm constantly fiddling with a fidget ring down here. So it's when you've got twiddly, figgly fingers, there are other things you can do to direct your attention. But the last type of trigger that I just want to tell you about before I move off this slide are sensory. So the way that I experience the worst type of triggers that I have is that it's like the follicles are shouting to me. It's a very sensory experience. I don't know how common this is, but if you just run your hands over your eyebrows or through your hair, sometimes you find one that hurts for some reason. There's no particular, and I think that's that little pain that you feel is corresponds to when a hair comes to the end of its natural cycle. But that's a massive trigger. I mean, I cannot leave those alone. If I felt one of those, I cannot leave it alone. And that's even now, with all of the good tools that I have and no longer feeling the shame that I used to feel, I can't resist those urges. Those are just impossible for me. So there's lots more things that you know about it. So last year I thought I would just try and learn a bit about it. Let me have a look at the literature. Fortunately, the field isn't very big, so you can survey the whole field without not too much time. And so I put together a perspective article that is a synthesis of my lived experience and what I learned as a neuroscientist by looking at the literature. The links for lots of the things that I'm showing you today, by the way, are on, if you look up the psychiatry department and then /BFRBs, you'll find it all. So in this paper, I made 3 points. One of them I've already made, which is that the comorbidities really complicate the picture. When people come at these disorders through the lens of psychiatry or psychology, they tend to come kind of effectively via one of these other disorders. So, and I think that as well as complicating the picture in terms of really understanding the phenomenology, I think that the other major complication that comorbidities give us is that because the level of comorbidities is so high, any kind of pharmacological therapy, so, trying antidepressants or anti-anxiolytics, etc., is kind of contaminated by, well, some people have anxiety too, or mood disorder too, etc. So having a really clean sample is tricky. So the comorbidities really complicate the presentation. But as I've said before, for me, the way to think about these disorders is that they are a motor symptom of distress. And the fact that they're motor is really important, because our motor system you know, many of the systems in our brain, well, in fact, our brain is a learning machine, but the motor system in particular is designed to learn sequences of movements and then execute them without going via the decision-making bits of your brain. That's how we learn to walk and talk and ride bikes and play tennis or whatever it is that you do. And so once you've established a motor pattern, a sequence of movements that is associated with something, your body is executing that without you really making any decisions about it. So I think that's a really important part of the whole picture. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize through the bit of research that I had done is that picking and pulling and biting is normal. We all pick and pull and bite at ourselves to a certain extent. It is normal primate grooming behavior. Primates groom both themselves and others for 3 reasons. They do it for hygiene, so it's kind of a motor aspect of your immune system to pick off parasites and things. They do it for environmental reasons, which are kind of fluffing up their coat so that they can respond, keep themselves warm and warm when they need to and cool when they need to. And the third reason that primates groom is social. It's social bonding. It's a way that primates establish their social hierarchies. I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. But essentially, the important message here is that picking, pulling, biting is normal. But what's not normal is finding yourself trapped in not being able to stop doing it. However, again, humans are not alone in this respect. So many animals, including primates, but not this also applies to mice and birds and all sorts of things, in distress will pull out their fur or hair or feathers or whatever it might be. And so the primates will pull out their own hair if they find themselves in distress, either by virtue of being right at the bottom of the social hierarchy, or if you put them in captivity. So there's something in us, which drives us to do this behavior when we're in some kind of distress. There's more to learn there. And then, as I've already said, the shame that people feel as a consequence of doing this, I think, is not only an unfortunate thing to live with, I think it actually creates this conditions in our brain that maintains the disorder. And I'll tell you more about that in a bit. And of course, unfortunately, stigma acts to amplify shame. So I'm now going to go through a few slides of background stuff that I've learned along the way. So these next few slides aren't anything that I've done. They're just things that I think are important that I've learned along the way. This slide is really just to give you some examples of papers that have done a good job of reviewing the literature, such as it is, on treatment strategies. So, of course, because it's a psychological psychiatric disorder, then there are kind of two strands of this. One is pharmacological treatment. So there have been lots of small, probably underpowered trials looking at the effect of antidepressants, anti-anxiolytics, antipsychotics even, and seeing whether that they have any effect in terms of reducing the behavior. Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. And I think that's that contamination with the comorbidities and the small sample size might mean we don't necessarily have a full picture of that yet. But at this point, there is no treatment that looks like that it has any validity as a first-line treatment for these disorders. And then the other type of therapeutic strategy is psychological, so cognitive behavior therapy, etc. And the one that's received the most attention is habit reversal therapy. And unfortunately, so habit reversal therapy is the one that's been trialed the most, and it has some efficacy attached to it. So there's some improvement in symptoms in people that have been on these trials. It's not a strong effect. And what I really worry about is that they don't track people for a long period of time to see how long the effects last. And what I hear in the support communities from people who've had who've attempted that sort of therapy, it doesn't work. It might work for a bit, but it doesn't work long term. And I think that's not surprising, because if you only target the behavior, there's so much more that you're not getting to. And so, you know, it works for a bit while you've got all your attention on it. But as soon as you sort of start to relax again, the behavior will be back. There was a study just last year, which is interesting. It's this one, so it's a decent RCT of a drug called memantine, which is a glutamatergic drug. It's actually a dementia drug, memantine, which is in my day job. I'm a dementia researcher, and so it's something that I come across in other contexts. There were 100 people in this trial, so it's a decent-ish size. And the effects were quite promising. So, I mean, it's interesting. Well, let's see where that goes. Personally, I don't think I'd be taking an anti-dementia drug, but you know, nevertheless, it's interesting that these things are being studied. It is important to make the point, I've already made it really, but in this 2007 study, the top left one here, Sam Chamberlain reviewed all of the treatment trials, both pharmacological and non-pharmacological, that had ever happened. He found 13 of them, and the total number of subjects across all 13 trials was 240. So that's not a strong evidence base for anything. So unfortunately, really the studies we need haven't been done yet. I think what I feel that I most want to do, or rather an opportunity that I feel that I have from the position that I have, is to try to convince people that these are really interesting disorders. And I'm going to try and convince you that you should all get interested in BFRBs from a neuroscience perspective or from a social science perspective. And part of the reason I think they're interesting is because they're complicated. So in order to really understand these disorders, these are the phenomena that you have to be able to account for. I've already mentioned them all, most of them. They're episodic, so the urges come and go. Most of the time, I don't have any urges when the urges come. Unfortunately, when the urges come, you can do a lot of damage in a short space of time, and so you kind of live with the consequences fairly long term.
Let's ask a question. What kind of timeline are we talking about in the episode?
Oh, really variable. Really variable. But so in terms of the length of time an episode can last for, it can last for hours when it comes. Mine never lasts more than 24 hours. Like when I notice that the urges are running hot, I have to find a way to get through that 24 hours, and then I know that they'll be gone again the next day. But I know that some people with these disorders get stuck in that trance, in that trap that I described earlier, so deeply that they actually can't get out of the house. So they'll miss school, they'll miss work, they'll find themselves still in the bathroom 10 hours later with the tweezers trying to find more hair to pull out. So when the urges come, I would say they last for hours, not days. But you can go weeks, months even between those episodes. But unfortunately, if you pull out your eyelashes, it takes 3 months to grow back your eyelashes. And so you only have to have half an hour of urges, and you've got 3 months to wait until you've got eyelashes again. So yes, episodic. They are episodic in nature. The urges come and go. The behavior itself is highly stereotyped within an individual. So, for example, if you collect together a group of people with trichotillomania, they'll show you the spot that they can't resist going to. On my head, mine was here, on the very top of my head. I don't think I ever will have the slightest inclination to pull hair from here or here or here, only ever here. So there's something very specific for me about that bit of my head. I could even point to which eyelashes I'm most tempted by. So it's highly stereotyped, where you go in terms of your pulling behavior. Important to understand that you don't really feel pain. So it would hurt if I pulled out hair here. It doesn't hurt when I pull. It's a different feeling. It's not pain in the same way. It's kind of it is a feeling, and it's sort of pleasurable. Some people really identify with pleasure. I don't strongly identify with pleasure, but I know it's not painful. Whereas if I pulled out hair, it would be painful, just like it would be for anyone else. So there's something funny about pain. I've already told you that the triggers aren't all the same, so you can't. There isn't just one way in to the episode. The episodes aren't all the same. Sometimes I can have a very brief, or I often notice myself doing it and can stop. But if I have one of those kind of trappy episodes, mine don't usually, as I said, mine last for less than 24 hours. And if I can take my fingers up enough, then I can get through it with still having some eyelashes. The trance-like state is a really, really important part of the phenomenology. And in fact, if it wasn't for the trance-like state, I don't think there'd be a problem, because you wouldn't, it's really that trance that where you do all the damage. You know, if you're just doing a little bit of picking, pulling, biting, whatever it is, you probably wouldn't have you wouldn't have a big bald patch to deal with. It's the trance-like state where you're completely dissociated from the world around you, where all the damage gets done. So that's a really important part of the phenomenology. I think there might be something about about episodes being more likely, particularly those sensory episodes being more likely if you're a bit under the weather. I'm an N of 1, I'm just figuring this stuff out, but I think there's something about your immune system signaling, which means you're more likely to have one of these episodes when you're feeling a bit unwell. And then I've already talked about the sorts of consequences that you live with: distress, functional impairment, and shame. So that's the phenomenology. And then there's a bunch of lenses we can look through. So psychiatrists will tend to look through the lens of understanding the plethora of different psychiatric disorders that there are in the world. And so there's a lot you can learn. If I go down this list, I think there are elements of each thing that's on this list. So mood, anxiety, OCD, impulse control disorder, addiction, self-harm, ADHD, and tics and Tourette's. I think there are elements of all of those things that are kind of relevant to BFRBs. And I think there are individuals who have BFRBs who are more clearly associated with one or other of these constructs. There's a lot that we know about the symptoms of all of these disorders that haven't necessarily been put together in the way that I think they need to be put together to understand BFRB. So there's a lot of good stuff we can find from inside the psychiatry lens. I've sort of separated out psychiatry and psychology slightly artificially, but within the psychological lens, I think there's something important about emotion or sensory regulation. So I've told you that my episodes are more likely to happen if I'm in a state of high emotion, if you like, and that can be positive or negative actually, but they're also quite likely if I'm in a state of very low, if I'm reading a thesis, for example. So there's something about being overstimulated or understimulated, and maybe it's some kind of regulatory process that's going on. So some people talk about perfectionism. Again, that doesn't particularly apply to me, but some people identify strongly with being perfectionists in other ways. And then there are also this idea of mediators, and I'll talk again about shame in that context in a bit. And then there's the cognitive neuroscience lens. So cognitive neuroscientists know a lot about action selection and decision making and motivation and reward and how we form habits. And again, you know, the University of Oxford is full of people who really specialize in this area. And so I think that there's a lot we can learn from cognitive neuroscience that's highly relevant to these disorders. These tend to be different people's brains I'm talking about, the different lenses people tend to come at these problems from. So this is how I understand BFRBs at this point. So I keep messing with this, but this is my model, the way that I understand it at the moment. So in my model, I'm starting with the sense of some kind of distress. And that distress can come from anywhere. So it could come from a psychological disorder, it could come from trauma, it could come from having a neurodevelopmental disorder like autism or ADHD. And as an aside, the research hasn't yet been done properly, but anecdotally, there seems to be a much higher prevalence of these disorders in people with autism and ADHD. So in my model, some kind of distress is caused, and that distress sets you up in your vicious cycle. So the distress causes the urge causes you to pick, pull, or bite. There's some kind of very brief relief or reward that comes from the picking, pulling, and biting. But unfortunately, that's followed by the wave of shame, which then keeps you in distress. And so around and around you go. Now, I think there are other ways into this circle. So as I've already said, I think there are some sensory and potentially immune related triggers for the urge itself. So I think that that sometimes urges will come with distress as a consequence rather than a cause. And then there's this idea of habit, meaning a motor pattern, an overlearned motor pattern, that actually that means you're doing it without having thought about it at all. Because it's just what your body is doing. It's just executing a sequence of movements without going via your frontal lobes. I think there might be something about there might be some sort of direct connection between this neurodevelopmental angle and the sensory angle. As you may know, people with autism and ADHD often have sensory symptoms, other sensory symptoms. So there might be something about sensation seeking or something like that that's particularly in relation to neurodevelopmental disorders. And then here is how I see the trance, the dissociation. So when you get stuck in a trance, there's no emotion anymore. You're cut off from the rest of your brain. You're literally just stuck in this little bottom half of this circle, just going around and around and around and around. It's only when you emerge from it that you then have to deal with the wave of shame that comes, that washes over you. And then the last bit of this is just the observation that stigma, of course, increases the shame that you feel. It's an amplifier of the shame that you experience. So I'm not really aware of time. Martin, how am I doing for time?
So well.
How do you know how far you don't know how far through I am? I might have only just started. Okay, I'll keep talking. Okay, so again, and now I'm back to some interesting observations or interesting things that I've found on my journey. This is a paper that I came across, and I've already actually described some of this to you. So this is about understanding self-grooming behavior in primates. And this is the picture, by the way, is the wrong primate. So the paper is about macaques. Actually, not sure which primate that is, but I'm pretty sure it's not macaques. Julie DeVosque and colleagues described these three types of drivers for grooming. So the parasitic or the immune driver, the environmental driver, and the social driver. And there was a particular sentence in this paper that just kind of jumped out to me, which is that the study indicates that the animals scratch at themselves primarily because of an immune or stimulus itch. That's exactly how it feels. It feels like an itch you have to scratch, possibly triggered by ectoparasitic bites and movements. But it also confirms that self-grooming can act as a displacement activity in the case of social uncertainty. And what they mean by social uncertainty is finding yourself at the bottom of that dominance hierarchy. So animals that are lower down the social hierarchy do more picking and pulling, biting at themselves. And I think that's important. And I'll come back to that in a bit. This is a new area that I'm only just starting to meander into, hair and skin science. So I didn't know anything about this at all. But it started with some, all of these things are starting from interesting conversations that I'm having with people. And I've only recently learned that the innervation, the nerves that serve a follicle, are actually incredibly complicated. There's an awful lot that goes on in our skin in terms of our nervous system. And I've only, again, recently learned that there's a thing called psychodermatology. Who knew that skin and psychology were connected, except that when I tell you about it, you'll realize you all know about it. Because what psychodermatology is about is recognizing that if you have eczema, psoriasis, anything skin related, it gets worse if you're stressed. So there's a connection between our skin and our psychological well-being that actually we all know about, but we just hadn't necessarily thought about it in quite this way. And so on the right there, you can see a classification of psychodermatological disorders. And so some of them are primarily dermatological conditions that are exacerbated by psychological, by stress or anxiety, whatever it might be. Some are psychiatric disorders, which have dermatological symptoms associated with them, and so trichotillomania is in that list. And then there are other things which, again, you'll have heard of, because you'll go, oh yeah. People report, it's rare cases where a major trauma causes somebody to lose all their hair, or all their hair turns white. So there's some connection between our emotional systems and our skin, which at first seems like, what? But actually, we all know it's there. As I say, I'm only just scratching the surface, haha, about that. Oops. There's a whole branch of cognitive neuroscience which is starting to think about habit formation and how this might have an important, essentially how our brains are the variability between us in the way that our brains learn associations, form a sort of stimulus reward association. So this is all kind of reward-based decision-making type things, and how actually if you zone in on particular things, so in this case Claire Gillen has zoned in on model-based learning, a way of learning about an association between stimuli, and then you look across a whole bunch of psychiatric disorders, you see that there's some kind of common theme, but that different disorders manifest it in different ways. And I'm not necessarily the most articulate about this in particular. I'm really just highlighting this because I think it's interesting rather than because I know a great deal about it. But there's something interesting here about how we make decisions about how to act, which we need to know more about. And then really the last bit of this is back to shame and stigma. So I told you that I would come back to this in a bit. And one of that book that I told you about shame, that one of the other really useful things that it did, in effect, was to link back to the first book, which is to teach me about what the point of shame is. So you kind of start, shame, nobody wants shame. What's the point of shame? But as I said, in relation to the compassionate brain, everything that we think and do and feel makes sense in some kind of evolutionary context. And shame and stigma exist because we're social animals. So there are evolutionarily, there are really good reasons to be a social animal. Here on the right, I'm listing all of the evolutionary advantages that you get from being a social animal. Information transfer, defense, and foraging and hunting, and being able to share resources, all that stuff means that we are, it's part of why we're such a successful species, is because we act together for the common good. But like everything in nature, there's a trade-off. So the trade-off disadvantages about being a social animal are risk of disease, competition between individuals, and stress. And so the way that I now think about stigma and shame, and I'm back to the primates really. I'm thinking that as primates, our social group is so important. It's important to our very existence. So the fear of being expelled from your social group is a mortal fear. It's actually a mortal fear. Evolutionarily, if you did something that meant that your group cast you off and went off without you, you'd die. You wouldn't survive. So the sense that we have of the importance of our connection to our social group is a mortal fear. And that's why stigma and shame are such powerful influences. So shame is the emotion that we feel that effectively checks, it's us checking with ourselves. Am I doing or saying or being anything in any way that's going to put me at risk of being expelled from my social group? Shame is there to protect us from expulsion. And we use shame to bring up our children. I use shame all the time to bring up my child. You mustn't cover yourself in food. You must, go to the toilet nicely. All of the things that we do that teach our children how to be acceptable in our social group. And shame is the feeling that we feel. We all know it. I feel it down here. We all know the feeling of having done something that puts us at risk of being not safe in our social group. And then stigma. So stigma is the emotion of the group that's felt by the individual, and shame is the feeling of the individual that's given to themselves. But stigma is essentially the other side of the same coin. So stigma is, as a group, we're going to be more safe without that one. So we'll push that one away from us in order to maximize our chances of survival. And so it's a kind of we're all trying to maximize our chances of survival and procreation and all of those things as primates, as hunter-gatherers. And stigma and shame are just a byproduct of all of that we have to live with because we're primates, and now we have to understand that in the context of living in the modern world. And the biggest headline of the stigma and shame that's associated with these disorders comes back to the why don't you just stop? If you knew how difficult it was for me to stop, you wouldn't tell me to just stop. And it's actually an attribution error. You're attributing to me the control over whether I can do this behavior or not in error. Okay, I'm feeling like I'm coming to an end, but I've still got a couple more slides to go. So I'm going to whiz through this one, but this is another area that I'm particularly excited about, which is the whole area of the human story as sort of put together by Robin Dunbar, who's an emeritus professor in the Department of Psychology here. He's really focused in on endorphins, and I think this is very exciting. So endorphins are our natural painkillers, so no pain. We get an endorphin rush when we exercise. There's all sorts of social situations that cause us to have endorphin rushes: dancing, singing, laughing, eating nice food. They all cause releases of endorphins. Endorphins are actually associated with trance states, kind of religious trance states. So there's endorphins involved in those. When primates groom each other, they get a release of endorphins. So endorphins might be really important to this in some way that I haven't fully put together yet, but it might explain quite a few of those aspects of the phenomenology that I talked about. Why doesn't it hurt? Why can't I stop? Why do I go into a trance, etc.? As I'll say in a moment, Robin has got interested and is going to join us in a study. So this is my I guess call to action. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of work that we need to do to understand these disorders. We're not there in terms of fully elucidating the phenomenology. The basic epidemiology hasn't really been done properly yet. We need to fully understand the incidence and prevalence. People don't get asked, when have you ever been asked by any doctor anywhere, do you ever pull out your hair or bite your nails or pick at your skin in a way that you can't control? So we don't know. There's no records on that in the general population in the UK. The only sort of substantial work that's been done is in the States. So there's a lot to learn. We need to put all of that phenomenology together to really understand the disorder properly. I've already talked a bit about the development of both pharma and psychological therapies, and I think that the psychological therapies need to incorporate that shame element. And if you don't incorporate that shame element, then essentially you're just putting off, you're basically going to be back in the circle again. Unfortunately, both of these require good measures, and the measures that exist, I think, have some problems. And so I think there's even work to do on the simple measurement of how we capture this stuff. And then when it comes to the mechanisms, well, there's a whole flower of things we need to do. It looks like there's some heredity. There's a whole bunch of molecular mechanisms that we're interested in exploring. I've talked about the cognitive neuroscience angle, that hair and skin science angle, which is brand new to me, but all sorts of interesting things to explore there. Social anthropology, the grooming, the dominance, the stigma, etc. There's stuff to understand there. And then the psychological aspects, emotion regulation, perfectionism, etc. There's a lot to do. We're about to start, and so we just got our first John Fell Fund grant at the end of the year. So I've got a new team but pulled together to start looking at both the mechanisms and the treatment angle. So Polly Waite and the Kathy Creswell and the topic team are now incorporating BFRBs as part of their work in children and young people with mood and anxiety disorders. Very exciting. We've got students working away at trying to do some of the groundwork on what the measures need to look like and how we're going to be able to put together a targeted therapy. On the mechanism side, we've got a bit of pilot funding to have a go at seeing whether we can measure endorphins in saliva and see whether we can send people home with tubes they can spit into when their urges are high and urges are low, and see whether we can measure any differences there. And this grant will also fund a symposium. So we're going to bring together for the first time in Oxford scientists from all over the spectrum that I've outlined. And yeah, so we're just starting this out, so watch this space. So I'm going to finish with a couple of back to personal things. And so this, as I've said, all started for me last year. I've done a lot in a year. I did a and you can find all of this on that BFRB page on the psychiatry website. I did I got interviewed on Women's Hour and published an article and got a grant and all of those things that I've told you about. But just to sort of finish off by showing you it's not just me, I'm going to show you some messages that came from strangers, and they're going to come too fast for you to be able to read every word, but essentially the red bits are the bits to concentrate on, and I can't really see them here, but essentially this is exactly how I felt all my life. I was made to feel that I was the weirdo. There's an 8-year-old boy that lives in my head that thanks you. This is the only way to end the shame. You've opened up my world. I thought it was just me. It made me cry. I've been picking and pulling for years. I can relate to every word. I get so frustrated with myself when I see what I've done to myself as a parent of a child. I see the shame that they struggle with, and I'm the one educating the professionals. My husband listened with me. We've never discussed it before at the age of 64. What you said resonated with my experience entirely. I'm a 19-year-old male. My parents don't understand me. Nobody understands me. Your description of the urges matches mine entirely. I heard you, and listening to you changed my life. You've taught me that the urges won't go, but the shame can. You've opened my cage. That disrupts my life in awkward ways, the shame spiral. I will listen with my daughter together so that she knows she's not alone. I wish other people would understand. And then the last one, which always makes me cry, I heard this was a tweet sent to Women's Hour by somebody who said that they just heard somebody say that pulling out your hair doesn't mean you have a character flaw. And I had to pull over in my car and have a cry because I thought I was weak and stupid since I was 11. So I know that I'm making a difference already, just 1 year in terms of helping people feel like they can talk about their BFRB, or at least know that they're not alone with their BFRB. So how does it feel now? Well, at the end of I'm doing what I'm about to show you. So at the end of a year, I feel just immense gratitude, actually. Thanks for the question earlier about how it feels to talk about it. Talking about it feels amazing. It feels amazing compared to living with it. So being able to say stuff out loud, and thank you for listening to me for probably a whole hour, makes me feel whole. It makes me feel like I can be all of me, which is kind of the title of the talk. I'm incredibly grateful to my department for letting me meander off into a new direction. Just feel enormous gratitude to the community that I'm now a part of, for sort of welcoming me in and being so positive about what we can potentially do together. And this is who it's all about. So I don't know this young lady. She's a generic person that I painted, but I want to make her life better because her suffering is real. It's just as real as anybody else's suffering. It deserves our attention and our respect. She needs to feel safe enough to ask for help, and we need for people to have some help to be able to give her. And the most important message is don't say just stop. So thanks very much. I've got some information there about where people can find peer support if any is needed. And I just wanted to flag my the coaching people, the people that helped me with some of the coaching that I talked about. So Izzy Reed is my sort of long-term now friend and coach who sat with me underneath that lampshade. She was the one that went, oh, look at that lampshade. And my sister is the last person on the slide. That's Jane Mackay. Jane's worked in mental health in various capacities over many years, not as a scientist, but as an advocate and as a anti-stigma campaigner. And she's has her own consultancy now. And she really helped me with what's called lived experience leadership, how to use your voice in order to empower other people. And so, yeah, great.
Thank you so much, Claire. I mean, I think this is pretty astonishing, really. The way that, classically, I mean, I think it's almost like reading one of the stories from one of the sex, that you are both protagonist and therapist, and the way that you've gone about then to make change. Yes? And I think the messages that you read out to us from how you've already made a difference in somebody's life, I think it's really quite amazing. So I'm sure there are lots of questions. I can see that Angela is right there, but I'll let you handle the questions. I'll just check online.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think it's really powerful that you have shared what is there for you in your lived experience with everybody. That's amazingly powerful. But what interests me about it is that it has given you some autonomy and control over it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It seems to me.
Yeah,
And the whole thing about the trance state.
yeah,
And being out, having no autonomy and control is
Yeah.
the opposite of that.
exactly.
I've worked for many years in the field of autistic spectrum
Mm.
disorder and all sorts of other neurodiverse situations, and I have come across a lot of what you describe amongst that population. And it has occurred for the people I've come across when they are very, very anxious or bored. So that fits in
exactly
very
the
much
same,
with
yeah,
what you're
yeah.
saying. And the other thing is that a lot of the people I've worked with had very little autonomy and control over their own lives. And I wonder if this, psychological factor of autonomy and control, it has something in the background of it. Because, when you talked about yourself and how, although your parents split up fairly amicably, and then you talked about adolescence as a time when it starts occurring. The thing about your parents splitting up, you lost autonomy and control over that aspect of your life. And then in adolescence, of course, the emotional brain is going mad, developing new wiring all the time. So there's a whole area of that particular area of your life where your autonomy and control, your ability to be consciously aware of what you are doing and have that self-awareness as a tool to go through life is perhaps diminished at that point.
That's really interesting. The other thing that I've thought about that particular point in time is relates to shame, and because shame is about our sense of safety and connection with our social group. Adolescence is also the time when we move from our primary group being our family to our primary kind of focus being our peers, and I think that's important too. But I think you're absolutely right that there's stuff going on in adolescence that, well, there's clearly stuff that's going on in adolescence, which means it's a peak time for all sorts of things to show up, isn't it? I'd love to talk to you more about the similar observations you've made with people with autism. Control is, so when I talk about and this is really just for the last year, the thing that feels really different for me now compared to a year ago, or 2 years ago at least, is that I felt like I had no control while Shane ran the show. While Shane was basically the thing that was, I was having to live that script with all that stuff going on in the background because I had carried so much shame. If you take shame out of the equation, then suddenly my autonomy and control, and as you put it, kicks in. And I go, oh, hang on a minute, this is an interesting problem. And I know some stuff and I can and so suddenly I have the sense that I can take over it rather than it taking over me. So I think there's a lot in that. That's really interesting. Thanks. Next question.
Don't do it, saying don't do it is very unhelpful and insensitive. But is there anything that your friends or family can say that is potentially helpful or at least sensitive? Yeah,
it's a good question and a common question. And the answer is not straightforward. But what I always say is that the best thing that a member of the family can try to do is to get alongside the young person that's suffering from the behaviour and recognize really recognize the uncontrollability of them. And so, I mean, I'm also a parent. My son doesn't pull out his hair, but he does pick it himself. He picks at his skin a bit. And so I say to him things like, it feels quite nice, doesn't it, when you pick it a scab? Yeah, no. But the thing is, if you do it, then it's not, you're going to make it worse. Do you want me to help you stop? Do you want me to see? I've got some things that I might be able to help you with. Do you want that? So it's very different than just like, go do it, not allowed. And I'm not saying I know the answers at all, because I don't really deal with this in a major way as a parent. But it's really about getting alongside. Don't be parent-child. Be adult, adult, but kind of collaborator in trying to do whatever they want to do, because probably they do want to stop. So be their collaborator in trying things out, like, oh, maybe we could try this, or maybe we could try that, and so try and get out of the overbearing.
Judging, isn't
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, it was simultaneous.
Yeah.
You can choose.
Okay, I was gonna say, you said that people usually say, oh, it's, because of OCD or whatever. Do you think that the act of pulling your hair or whatever can cause those disorders? Like, the disorders don't cause the action, but the action causes those other disorders, like, because you have no, or so you're in trance, you have no control, would that cause OCD and eventually?
Really good question. I don't think it would cause OCD, but I do think it would cause mood and anxiety problems.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'm sure that it causes that where people, there's a really high overlap with anxiety and mood disorders. I don't know, because I haven't got data that would prove it, but I suspect strongly that a lot of that mood and anxiety trouble, those struggles because of mood and anxiety, are caused by the disorder rather than the other way around. The reason why I say no to OCD is because I think of OCD as being quite different. And really it's because of the obsession. So OCD is characterized by having obsessive thoughts that then lead to a compulsion to do something. So if you just think of hand washing, which is the kind of paradigm example of OCD, cognitively, for me, that feels very different than how I feel when I find myself pulling out hair. So I don't know whether, I suppose that in the same way as one causes some distress that then opens the door from the other, then maybe. But I think of OCD specifically as being kind of a bit different.
Because you think about it and then you do an action rather than you're just doing it.
There's no thoughts. There are no obsessions. There's no thoughts. There's no thoughts, and therefore there's no way in. So the whole of habit reversal is about trying to identify the moment before and then do something differently. But if you don't have a moment before, there is no conscious decision made to do it. So you can't consciously not decide to do. Decide not to do it.
It's just like walking.
It's like walking. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you, Claire. That's a lovely talk. Beautiful talk. You're a beautiful person.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't know what I was going to, but I didn't know what the title was. I just saw every word apart from trichotillomania. I knew it resonated with a lot.
Oh.
So I'll try and say it a lot quickly. This question I had about wigs.
Yeah.
After I said it, quite a bad question, really. Like, that's
It's a good question.
symptom, right?
But it's actually a way of hiding, which
Sure,
is
okay,
which is
so,
important.
okay, and in
Really
terms of-
important to people.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Right, 1, 2. When you spoke about art and using that as therapy, and as I've had this idea and had conversation with it a lot. That's a tool into your brain. Your brain, you can record oscillations over, get numbers. You can look at art and get numbers. Or machine learning, this kind of thing, you get features that can actually be useful. Okay, you draw a picture, and then do some kind of clustering. That might be hard to do maybe, but what's simpler is draw a picture, you look at your picture, or someone who you care about or connected to looks and then record from their brain, and from that you have quite an interesting holistic way of exploring not just any mental health, but just everything. Have you thought about this as a kind of direction, using art as an empirical tool?
As an empirical tool, as opposed to a sort of therapeutic tool. I mean, it's funny. It's a really good question. Art also emerged for me during my sort of process of going through everything that I described to you today. It sort of, the reason I put up the book that I taught, the Artist's Way book, is because I really strongly believe in that whole, you just need to get out of your own way and then the art will flow sort of thing. As an empirical tool, I mean, we'll have to talk more about that. I've never thought about that, but it's an interesting idea.
And on talking more, I wrote a grant proposal recently, had some figures. It's now a supplementary figure, okay? But this supplementary figure, I do really believe it could be a very powerful therapy, not just for this, but for all sorts. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Great. Look forward to it.
Well, but there'll be plenty of opportunities now over coffee and chocolate,
Yeah.
and soon we'll have the Lebanese. But I thought I'd just round up by maybe asking you, because of course, you talked about the habit reversal. And
Yeah.
one of the habits that most people find most difficult to break is smoking.
Yeah.
And there's also some pain and pleasure there.
Yeah.
There's some interesting, and again, it's very hard to decide when is the moment that you feel the urge to take that. And so there's a lot of work in trying again to use things like habit reversal, some CBT interventions, and people try this, and usually after about 2 weeks, people are smoking again and doing exactly the same thing. But a friend of mine who has done a lot of work in Johns Hopkins on this has shown that if you give people a little bit of psilocybin, and then you do exactly the same CBT intervention, 6 months and a year later, and you were talking about long-term outcomes, they, for whatever reason, it looks like 60 to 7% are no longer smoking.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to say that I think psychedelics is a good treatment, but it's one of those things that is curious, yes? And so one of the cool things is that he's worked with NIDA, so we now have the data, so we can look at what is actually happening at those time points in those both that are able to do this and not. But I'm just thinking, again, I think one of the key things that come out of your talk is it's about thinking out of the box as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I love that, and I think this idea of the art, of course, is something again in the sense of flourishing that we love. Right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of fertile ground here. So there's not really a question here. It's more sort of an ongoing conversation. And I think we should continue downstairs.
Good.
And I think I just want to help you again. Let's thank Claire for an amazing talk. And thank you online as well. Take good care.